Уважаемые коллеги, доброе утро еще раз. Спасибо большое, что пришли в столь ранний час. Кратко представлю профессора Роберто Унгера и передам ему слово. Роберто Унгер – это величайший философ современности, который знаменит, можно сказать, на обоих континентах, как через Атлантику звучал очень громко и ярко в разных контекстах. Его даже Владимир Владимирович как-то приглашал на Валдайский клуб, он не приехал, потому что сказал, неинтересно мне. Не тот уровень. Но к нам решил заглянуть проездом, так сказать, из Бостона. В двух словах о профессоре. Профессор преподает в Гарвардской школе права, при этом является самым, наверное, молодым в истории Гарвардской школы права человеком, получившим полный статус профессора, так называемый tenure, и с тех пор неразлучно идет вместе с Гарвардским университетом, где воспитал не одно поколение великих ученых, политиков, теоретиков, философов. Леопольд Шпехт, наш второй гость, как раз из этой плеяды, писал докторскую диссертацию у профессора Унгера еще тогда, когда в России была советская власть. Когда она закончилась, только закончилась, надо сказать, на переломном этапе. И одним из учеников профессора Унгера был Обама. Потом профессор Унгер перешел в практическую плоскость, работал министром стратегического развития Бразилии в администрации президента Лулы да Сильва, который очень существенно трансформировал страну, перевел ее, по большому счету, с рельсов аграрной и довольно примитивной с точки зрения динамики развития страны в авангард современного мирового развития, на который нам только равняться сейчас. Бешеный рост по целому направлению, в целых отраслях. Комплексное развитие Амазонии был проект, который отвечал профессор Унгер, будучи на посту министра стратегического развития этой страны. Отвечал за взаимоотношения и структурирование отношений с странами БРИКС, в том числе несколько раз приезжал с официальными визитами в Россию, где тесно взаимодействовал с нашими коллегами, на тот период отвечавшими за структуру БРИКС, Игорем Сечиным и Николаем Патрушевым. После реализации целого ряда системных проектов вернулся на преподавательскую работу. И сейчас мы приветствуем профессора Унгера в стенах Высшей школы экономики. Лео, добавите пару слов? Про профессора, про вашего учителя. 2 слова. И потом перейдем.
Так. Первое, я хочу сказать, что я закончил мою диссертацию, когда Россия была уже Россия, не СССР, я не так старый. Второе, мы предлагаем, что это не будет формальный доклад и формальная лекция, но что у господина Унга будет возможность в начале определенной тезисы здесь сказать, и потом мы предлагаем, что у нас будет разговор. Это нам очень интересно, нам очень важно слышать вашу критику, слышать ваше мнение, и мы очень надеемся, что эти следующие 2 часа будут дискуссию.
Не стесняйтесь задавать вопросы, и профессор очень любит живую и интересную дискуссию, поэтому любые, даже провокационные вопросы будут приветствоваться. Поэтому я передаю микрофон.
Thank you very much. I don't intend to deliver a formal lecture. I intend to speak informally about 2 related themes. The first theme is the criticism and the transformation of economic science, of economics as a discipline. And the second theme is the reconstruction of economic institutions and of the strategy of national development in our countries. And my attempt will be then to relate the criticism and transformation of economics as a discipline to the reconstruction of the path of national development. The central impulse in both parts of my discussion is rebellion, the imperative, the possibility, and the methods of intellectual and practical insurrection. So I begin with economics. Approaching the criticism and transformation of economics as an instance of the more general project of developing a way of understanding structure and the transformation of structure in contemporary societies. The economics that now prevails in the world is the economics that resulted from the marginalist revolution of the late 19th century. When today throughout the world we speak about economics, what we have in mind is this very specific intellectual tradition that began in the late 19th century, inaugurated by Walras and his contemporaries. That's what economics means today. And it turns out, surprisingly to the non-economists, that the prime subject of economics, of this economics that was created by the marginalists, is not the economy. The prime subject of economics is economics itself. Now, here are 4 criticisms of this intellectual tradition. The first criticism is that it has established a disconnection, a lack of connection, between the analytic apparatus and any causal or normative claims about the economic order. Von Mises and the Austrians understood very clearly that the kind of economics that the marginalists inaugurated is much less a causal theory of the economy, of its operation and transformation, than it is a kind of logic. It is a representation of the entire economy as a series of interconnected markets. The way that this style of economic theory operates is to create a pure apparatus of analysis that is innocent of any causal or normative claims. All the causal and normative claims are supplied from the outside. But the analytic apparatus itself, in its purest form, is supposed to be entirely empty of any controversial causal or normative ideas. Now, actually, there is no other example in the history of modern thought of such a theoretical strategy, with a single exception. The only exception is Kelsen's so-called pure theory of law, which similarly to this analytic strategy of economic marginalism, attempted to establish a pure analytic framework empty of controversial causal or normative claims. Now, the reason why the marginalists were attracted to this strategy is that they wanted to create an economic science that would not be vulnerable to the ideological and theoretical controversies of the time, that would be entirely agnostic or neutral in the contest among different visions. But the practical consequence is to produce a form of thought that, unlike natural science, is incapable of progressive transformation. One might say that this kind of economics is condemned to a perpetual infancy. There are many consequences of this analytic strategy. One consequence is that any discovery about the actual operation of the market or of the economy that does not converge with the theoretical expectation fails to lead to a transformation of the theoretical ideas. You simply produce another model. There's a proliferation of models. You adjust the factual stipulations or the normative assumptions, but you don't change the analytic apparatus. That is not like physics. There is no counterpart to this theoretical strategy in natural science. Often we say that economics is burdened with physics envy, but it's not like physics. In natural science, to understand something is to understand how it can change. Transformative insight is the condition of understanding of the phenomenon. There is no such connection established in this tradition of economics between insight into the actual and imagination of the possible. Another consequence of this analytic strategy is the abuse of mathematics. So the tradition of economic science inaugurated by marginalism is fascinated with mathematical tools. But it turns out that the mathematics employed by economics is for the most part a very primitive mathematics, a kind of toy mathematics. It's really deployed as a kind of logic rather than as an instrument of causal imagination. Now comes a second criticism of this pseudo-science of economics inaugurated by the marginalists. The second criticism has to do with its ambivalence or confusion about institutions. I was saying that in its purest form, economics makes no causal or normative assumptions. It's a kind of logic. How then can it be deployed to deal with practical problems in the world? There are two illicit identifications. First, the abstract idea of economic rationality is identified with the market. So, for example, you have Hayek's notion that the market is a form of spontaneous order or spontaneous coordination. It doesn't need to be invented or designed. It is implicit in the free coordination of economic agents. And then there is a second, more momentous equivalence. Having identified the abstract idea of economic rationality with the market, the abstract notion of the market is then identified with a very particular contingent set of legally defined economic arrangements. The tendency of the economists is to imagine that a market is a market, property is property, and contract is contract. For over 100 years, legal thought has demonstrated exactly the opposite. There is no natural and necessary form of a market system. A market system can take radically different forms with different consequences for the organization of production as well as for the distribution of economic advantage. The market idea is institutionally empty, even in its most abstract form. So consider the following. When we think about a market economy, even in an abstract form, there are at least two dimensions in the concept. One dimension has to do with the absolute degree of economic decentralization, the number of economic agents who are able to bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. The second dimension of the abstract market idea has to do with the degree of control that each of those agents exercises over the resources at his command. Will the control be unlimited, or will it be temporary and conditional? There is no natural relationship between these two aspects of the market idea. For example, you might say that by limiting the degree of control, the absoluteness of property, by, for example, generating conditional and temporary property rights, you might actually be able to increase the absolute amount of economic decentralization. With respect to the presuppositions, the institutional presuppositions about the market, we could classify economics into three main types. First, there's pure economics, exemplified in the 20th century by people like Debord or the theorists of general equilibrium. It has no conception of the market as an institutional system. It's an analytic technique that could be deployed in any institutional context. Second, there is an ideological economics, exemplified by economists like Milton Friedman, that associates economic rationality with the market, and then the market with a very concrete set of economic institutions. And third, you might say there is an equivocating economics, exemplified by the work of the American Keynesians or macroeconomists. So this kind of economics purports to study law-like relationships between large-scale economic aggregates, such as the levels of saving, investment, and employment, against a shadowy institutional background. So, for example, an economist claims that there's a relationship between the level of employment and the level of saving. Any change in the institutional background would then undermine this regularity. It could be a modest change, like the existence or the level of unemployment insurance. But if the society is relatively stagnant in its institutional arrangements, this qualification can be disregarded in practice. And the institutional background, although it is entirely contingent and historical, can be treated as if it were natural and permanent. The third criticism of this tradition of economic science is that it entirely lacks a theory of production. At its heart, it is just a theory of exchange. And in that respect, the post-marginalist economics is very unlike the classical economics of thinkers such as Adam Smith and Karl Marx. There is no theory of production. Production is viewed through the lens of exchange, as a shadowy extension of exchange. Even in an economist like Keynes, notice that all the key concepts, the liquidity preference, the propensity to consume, the state of long-term expectations, are psychological rather than institutional concepts. And they present no theory of the workings of the economy as a system of production rather than just as a system of exchange. The fourth criticism of this tradition of economic theory is that it has no account of the genesis of the diverse material on which the competitive selection of the market system operates. Let me make an analogy to the neo-Darwinian synthesis in biology. There is a theory of competitive selection, Darwinian natural evolution, and there is a genetic theory of variation or mutation. The fecundity of a process of competitive selection obviously depends on the richness of the material on which the mechanism of competitive selection operates. But post-marginalist economics has no theory of how this diverse material is generated. For example, the existence of separate states in the world with their own economic institutions and strategies is, from the standpoint of pure economics, an accident or an embarrassment. It has no properly economic significance. The cumulative effect of these four sets of limitations is to produce a style of economic thought that is completely powerless to understand the transformative possibilities of economic life. It has no transformative imagination. And now let me generalize and radicalize my criticism. This style of economics is impotent insofar as it is pure, and it is compromised insofar as it is potent. It acquires programmatic and explanatory potency only by compromising its analytic purity and by importing from outside itself normative commitments or causal theories. It is incapable of generating itself any causal theory. Now, here's the background to these methodological and epistemological problems that I've been describing. Today in the academy, in the high culture of the North Atlantic societies, across the whole field of social and historical studies, one finds the predominance of three intellectual tendencies. In the hard, positive social sciences, the rationalization of the established arrangements. And the most important instance of this tendency is economics, this post-marginalist economics that I've just criticized. The arrangements are represented as being natural or necessary or superior as the result of an evolutionary winnowing out of what works. In the normative disciplines of political philosophy and legal theory, what prevails is a humanizing tendency. The pseudo-philosophical justification of compensatory redistribution in the theories of justice, or of the idealization of law as a system of abstract principles. And the real project, then, is the justification of institutionally conservative social democracy, the social democratic compromise of the mid-20th century. And in the humanities, what we have is a subjectivist adventurism, disconnected from the reimagination and reconstruction of society. The rationalizing, humanizing, and escapist tendencies seem to be in conflict, but in fact they are allies in the disarmament of the transformative imagination. So there's a problem. There's a problem for the intelligentsia in our societies. They have lost faith in the large narratives of transformation such as Marxism. And their tendency then is to capitulate, to surrender to this form of intellectual life that now prevails in the academy of the rich North Atlantic societies. Example, post-marginalist economics. But what these disciplines represent, in fact, is a kind of right-wing Hegelianism. They are a mystification of social life. Their central thesis is the rationality of the real. This is not science, because it has no insight into transformative possibility. It severs the vital connection between insight into the actual and imagination of the possible, of the adjacent possible, of the next steps. And therefore, it fails to provide us with the intellectual instruments with which to understand our own society. So what do we need? We need intellectual rebellion. We need a contest over the methods and directions of each discipline, beginning with the two most important disciplines of institutional imagination, which are economics and law. Now I proceed to the second part of my discussion, which is about the redirection of development, the reconstruction of economic institutions in our societies, as opposed to the criticism and transformation of economics as a discipline. And I'm going to divide this second part of my remarks in turn into two stages in order to offer at least the outline of an example. So first, consider the following. We now are witnessing in the world the emergence of a new style of production. A style of production that is sometimes described as post-Fordist. The dominant style of production, especially of industrial production in the 20th century, was Fordist mass production, characterized by the large-scale production of standardized goods and services with relatively rigid machines and production processes, very hierarchical and specialized work relations, and semi-skilled labor. This form of production begins to be replaced in all major economies in the world by a new way of working and of producing. And how are we to characterize this new way of working and producing? Superficially, it involves the accumulation of high technology and of capital. At a second level, it's sometimes described as flexible, customized production. The de-standardized production of goods and services with flexible machines and production processes, attenuating rigid contrasts between conception and execution, and moderating the distinctions among all specialized work roles. At the deepest level, this new form of production is not simply production informed by science. In a sense, it is a materialization of science. Its tendency is to transform production into a practice of permanent and radical innovation. The plan of production is continuously revised in the course of its implementation. The relationship between people and machines is progressively changed. The machine does everything that we have learned how to repeat, so that our time can be preserved for that which we have not yet learned how to repeat. This is a revolutionary project. But here is the problem. The problem is that this advanced form of productive experimentalism remains largely quarantined, isolated in productive vanguards that are weakly linked to the other sectors of our national economies. And the great majority of the labor force is excluded from these advanced sectors. There are two traditional instruments with which to moderate the inequalities that result from the hierarchical segmentation of an economy. The first instrument is compensatory and retrospective redistribution organized by the state, so-called tax and transfer. The second instrument is the promotion or defense of small business against big business. Neither of these two instruments is adequate to the task of overcoming the inequalities and exclusions that result from the division between advanced and backward sectors of a national economy. There is then a task. The task is to open the gateways of access to these advanced sectors so that a large part of the economy and of the society can participate in them. That task can only be accomplished through institutional innovation, innovation in the content of a market economy. It's not just regulating the market economy. It's not just attenuating the inequalities produced in the market through retrospective redistribution. It is reshaping what a market economy is, how it is organized legally and institutionally. And here are three dimensions on which such a project could take place. The first dimension is to innovate in the arrangements governing the relationship between governments and firms. We have now in the world two models of relations between government and firms. There is the American model of the arm's length, the distant regulation of business by government. And there is the Northeast Asian model of formulation of unitary trade and industrial policy imposed from the top by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. What we would need is a third model, a form of strategic coordination, of alliance, of partnership between governments and firms, networks of small and medium-sized firms that is decentralized, pluralistic, participatory, and experimental, to the end of disseminating the advanced practices of post-Fordist production in a large part of the national economy. The second dimension of institutional innovation would be to innovate in the relationships among firms, to create regimes of cooperative competition. The firms would be able to compete against one another in a market, but at the same time to cooperate, to pool certain financial, technological, and commercial resources, achieving economies of scale. The third dimension of institutional innovation would be to reshape the relationship of finance to the real economy. In all the contemporary market systems, production is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. All empirical studies have shown that the vast preponderance of the financing of production is internally generated in the production system itself. What then is the point of all of that money in the banks and the stock markets? Theoretically, it is to finance the productive agenda of society. In fact, the vast preponderance of financial activity has only an oblique or episodic relation to production. The result is that finance is largely indifferent to the real economy in good times and destructive in bad times. Now, why does it have to be this way? We would have to innovate in the creation of arrangements that enlist finance in the service of production, forcing it to be a good servant rather than allowing it to be a bad master. For example, tax and regulatory changes that would inhibit those forms of financial activity that make no plausible contribution to the expansion of output or the enhancement of productivity. These three dimensions of institutional change amount to the beginnings of an innovation in the institutional content of the market economy. And they look to a horizon for the future. What then is this horizon? What is the long-term future that results from such a project? What is the direction in which it goes? First, it moves in the direction of creating a market economy which is not fastened to a single dogmatic version of itself. Different regimes of private and social property may be able to coexist experimentally within the same market order. Second, it creates a situation in which economically dependent wage labor may cease to be the dominant form of free labor. In the 19th century, liberals and socialists alike regarded wage labor as a transitory and defective compromise, retaining some of the features of slavery and serfdom. And they believed that it was only a transition to the higher forms of free labor, which are self-employment and cooperation. Then in the 20th century, we began to think that the predominance of wage labor is necessary or inevitable or natural. The third dimension, the third aspect of this long-term future is that we would come to revise the relationship between people and machines. Our idea would be this. Everything that we learn how to repeat, we express in a formula. Everything that we express in a formula, we embody in a machine. The machine does everything that is repeatable so that our greatest resource, which is time, can be preserved for that which we have not yet learned how to repeat. Now I come to the second and final part of my reflection on economic reconstruction. I've spoken in the abstract about the new form of production and its institutional requirements. I now want to relate this to the concrete problem of development in countries like Russia and Brazil, my country. There is an obvious task of creating a strategy of national development that diminishes our dependence on primary production. For example, on oil, gas, the production and the export of commodities, and the extraction of natural resources. There is the temptation to imagine that we could organize economic progress by simply superimposing on primary production a high technology sector. Now, obviously, this is preposterous. It's absurd. Because what primary production has in common with the high technology sector is that these two forms of economic life generate relatively little employment. It's not a solution for the society. It's a political economic fantasy. So we need to have a different idea. And the idea might begin to develop along the following lines. We need a vanguard, a locomotive of the national economy, so to speak, with all these characteristics that I mentioned before of what the new productive vanguardism is. It's not simply high technology. It's a new form of permanent innovation, of productive experimentalism that is in principle applicable to any sector of economic life. To be useful, it cannot be an isolated enclave. It must be a lever of transformation of the other sectors of the economy. On the one hand, it must be used to transform the character of agriculture, of oil, gas, of the other areas of natural resource extraction. And on the other hand, it must be used to create a new style of advanced, idea-rich, flexible manufacturing that can serve as the terrain for the operation of a multitude of small and medium-sized businesses, a vibrant, diversified urban economy that becomes the context of a radicalized productive vanguardism, of experimentation in the conception and making of de-standardized commodities and services. Now, such a project cannot be advanced except in the context of institutional innovations, such as the innovations that I described before. Decentralized strategic coordination between governments and small firms, cooperative competition among the small firms, and innovation in the arrangements governing the relation of finance to the real economy. Now, in my discussion, I have proceeded at two very different levels that at first may seem not to be connected at all, but they are connected. I began with a criticism of economics, and I suggested that we need to overcome the radical limitations of the dominant post-marginalist tradition in economics. We need to create an economics that, like the economics of Adam Smith or Karl Marx, is a causal theory of the operation of the economy. That does understand that the market has no natural or necessary institutional form. That does insist on being a theory of production and not simply a theory of exchange. And that does provide an account of the genesis of the diverse material on which the mechanism of competitive selection operates. Unless we create such an economics, we have no way of thinking through the transformations that I addressed in the second part of my remarks about economic reconstruction. We could ask ourselves, what kind of economics would be useful as a device of the transformative imagination? Not this economics that was produced by the marginalist revolution, another economics. But then that task imposes a burden on the national intelligentsia. It cannot simply surrender to the dominant tendencies of thought in the North Atlantic Academy. It has to devote itself to an intellectual rebellion and create another way of thinking. The program of economic reconstruction that I outlined in the second part of my remarks similarly requires that our countries repudiate the institutional blueprint that is now being disseminated in the whole world from its basis in the rich North Atlantic countries. The premise is the rejection of the focus of ideological controversy over the last 200 years. It's the idea that ideological controversy has as its limit the reconciliation of the state and the market understood as it has been understood conventionally. So the horizon of political discussion in Western Europe and North America today is almost entirely limited to the attempt to reconcile European-style social protection with American-style economic flexibility within the limits of the established institutional compromise. That's not good enough for us. To achieve a program of national development, such as the one that I described, we have to reimagine the content of the market economy. And that would lead us to other projects in the reimagination of the institutional form of civil society and of the state. It's therefore a work of rebellion, a political rebellion combined with intellectual rebellion. What we have outside the North Atlantic world today is not this construction of new alternative forms of the market, democracy, and civil society. What we have is an amorphous combination of neoliberalism, state capitalism, and compensatory redistribution as a proxy, as a substitute for the structural transformations that we require. Now, I think it's very clear that these two projects that I have proposed to you, the creation of intellectual alternatives, as in the revision of economics, and the creation of institutional alternatives in practical political economy, have something in common. What they have in common is the assertion of an idea of originality. It's an assertion of the capacity to make something new in the world. It is ultimately an idea of greatness. And for that reason, it is disturbing. But this is the disturbance which we must accept. We cannot understand the world or change it unless we undertake this task of rebellion and of transformation.
Sorry, microphone not working. Well, I'll try to speak out loud. Pavel Prokopiev, High School of Economics. You told us about strategic alliance between business and state. Could you please give us a couple of examples?
Yes.
And what legal tools might be used to achieve that?
All of the institutional proposals that I described have historical precursors. Now, I'll give you an example of the creation in the 19th century of family-scale agriculture in the United States. A common belief of the 19th century economists, shared by Karl Marx in Das Kapital, is that capitalism required the emptying out of the land and the process of agrarian concentration, as happened in England. But the Americans rejected this path. They distributed the land, and they organized what in a contemporary vocabulary we would call decentralized strategic coordination. The government, not just the national governments, but the local governments in 19th century America, didn't simply distribute land. They organized a process of technical assistance, and they helped shape the structure of commercialization of the agricultural output. At the same time, the family farmers, who were individual property owners, cooperated and pooled resources. exactly what, in a contemporary vocabulary, we would call cooperative competition. When they did this in the sphere of agriculture, the Americans were not regulating the market economy. They were creating, in the agricultural sector, a different kind of market economy from the kind that existed before. Now take another 19th century example from the same country, from the United States, finance. In the period of the presidency of Andrew Jackson, in the early 19th century, there was a conflict over the financial sector that resulted in the dissolution of the national bank in the United States and the prohibition of all national banks. And the Americans then proceeded to develop the most decentralized system of credit, credit for the producer, not just for the consumer, that had ever existed in the world up to that point. That too was an innovation in the institutional form of the market economy. So what I'm saying is that if we look back at historical experience, we would see many examples like these of sectoral innovations in the institutional form of the market economy. What I'm saying is that to create the practical conditions for socially inclusive economic growth in our societies, and to overcome the dependence on primary production, we would need to produce innovations like those innovations on a much larger scale in every sector of economic life. But we don't have the ideas, we don't have the intellectual instruments for such a process of institutional reconstruction. So economics as a discipline, according to this argument of mine, is more part of the problem than it is part of the solution. It is an obstacle to transformative insight rather than an instrument of transformative insight. Look, for example, at China today. So there is a vast array of micro-institutional experiments in the relations among firms and in the relations between firms and local governments or other stakeholders. But this micro-institutional experimentalism in China is taking place under a twofold constraint. First, the constraint of dictatorship, of political authoritarianism, and second, the constraint of mental colonialism. There isn't any doctrine of how these small-scale institutional experiments might serve as the point of departure for the development of an alternative national project. And a similar situation is reproduced throughout much of the world. The world is full of small-scale institutional experiments, but we don't have either the political conditions or the intellectual instruments with which to take these small-scale experiments as the material for the development of large-scale alternatives.
And I would go a step further. We see now in Europe, as a consequence, ironically, of the financial crisis, the attempt to very often repress alternatives which emerge because of the need of the productive sector to find capital. You might be familiar with the term crowdsourcing. Now, right now in the country I come from, which is Austria, there is a tendency of regulatory authorities to repress crowdsourcing because it would, with a very narrow view on finance activities, require a banking license.
You should explain what it is.
you are familiar with crowdsourcing or not? Yeah, these are all economists. So it is repressed because of regulatory requirements, which result from a very narrow institutional view of banking. At the same time, the banks are loaded with money, which they get for nothing from the European Central Bank, and do not invest into the productive economy. So not only do we see that there's no imagination in terms of causing something new or helping something new to develop, which is actually responding to a need of the economy, of the productive sector of the economy, there's the opposite.
Большое спасибо уважаемому профессору. Я не экономист, а юрист, Савюк Леонид. Уважаемый Роберто, скажите, пожалуйста, не следует ли понимать ваш пламенный призыв к интеллектуальному восстанию как заувалированную форму похоронения кейнсианства и не менее пламенного призыва к возрождению вечно живого марксистского учения в экономической его части? Это первый вопрос. И второй связан с вашим прогнозом на будущее по 3 позициям. Создание рыночной экономики, не привязанной к собственности. Модернизация рабочей силы, которая перестанет быть силой, создающей прибавочный продукт. И, наконец, пересмотр отношений между людьми и машинами. В последней части бог с ним. Это естественный процесс, и он имеет право на существование. Скажите, пожалуйста, а на какую историческую перспективу рассчитана вот эта желаемая вами трансформация? Спасибо.
Well, I'll make 2 comments by way of response. So, first, I do agree that Keynesianism is not a true alternative. As I suggested in my exposition, Keynesianism is not a theory. It's not a causal theory of the workings of the economy. It has no account of production. It has no clear view of institutions or of institutional alternatives. It participates in the general tendency of English political economy of reducing the institutional to the psychological. However, I do not believe that the repudiation of marginalism and Keynesianism justifies simply a return to Marx. I believe that like all of classical social theory, Marxism has the great advantage of having a structural vision. It has a vision of history as a discontinuous history of alternative structures. But the defect of Marxism, as of much of classical social theory, is that it compromises this structural imagination by historical determinism or fatalism or necessitarianism. It sees history as the procession of a series of indivisible and predetermined institutional systems. And that's just not how history happens. There aren't these indivisible systems. Change is structural, but nevertheless fragmentary or piecemeal. So our task in general in social thought is to rescue the structural insight from this incubus, this burden of the deterministic assumptions, and to produce a way of understanding history and society that is structural without being determinist. Now that then leads me to my second remark. In this task of a structural but not deterministic form of imagination, legal thought is a crucial element. The institutional variations that we were just discussing exist in the form of law. The German historicists were correct in understanding law as the institutional form of the life of a people. All the institutional material with which we work to develop alternatives exists in the form of legal variations. Therefore, law should not be understood as simply a technique at the service of state power. Law should be understood as the terrain for the discovery of the institutional variations that already exist in small scale and that can be used as the instrument for the construction of institutional alternatives. Now, none of this is a task of forecasting, of prediction. Unlike Karl Marx, I don't believe that history supplies us with our program. We make our program. It's not our business to predict the future. It is our task to create it.
Большое спасибо. Евгений Салыгин, факультет права. Скажите, пожалуйста, уважаемый профессор, относительно инноваций социальных, экономических, управленческих, они действительно реализуются в сфере малого, среднего бизнеса, в различных локальных сообществах, и тем не менее они имеют ограничения, обусловленные с правовым регулированием, которое, в свою очередь, исходит от государства. И так или иначе серьезные инновации связаны с законодательным регулированием, а оно находится в руках у правящей элиты. Как вы считаете, что является стимулом для правящей элиты для того, чтобы реализовывать различные инновации, менять структуру экономики, перераспределять различные блага и менять отношения, о чем вы говорили, в трудовых ресурсах и так далее, если элиту устраивает то положение дел, которое существует?
So I agree with you, and I see the implication of your remark is that the project of democratizing the market cannot advance beyond a certain point unless it is complemented by the project of deepening democracy. So if the state is in the hands of an authoritarian technocracy, it's very unlikely that an economic program like the one that I outlined could be pursued. Then there's the practical political issue of how can such a process of institutional innovation begin when the power of the state is in the control of a small number of people who are above all concerned to maintain that power. And the answer that history gives is straightforward. Transformation occurs as the result of a combination of historical opportunities. Typically, there is an imperative of developing national power and national wealth, creating an interest in institutional alternatives. And then there is a conflict within the elites, and some faction of the elites in its struggle against the other faction, appeals to the outsiders. And this struggle within the elites, resulting in a mobilization of some of the outsiders, of some of the excluders, of the excluded, in the context of a national crisis, is what produces the opportunity for transformation. If I may be allowed, I actually have a question to the group, which is, I would like to understand the situation of intellectual debate about economics and its sister social sciences in Russia today. Is there a living debate about alternatives to post-marginalist economics in Russia today, and what is the form of that debate?
My profession is not economics, so I cannot go into academics of economics. I think that the biggest debate now is in economical policies, whether it should proceed to socialism, or we do transition and introduce some liberal values into economy. This is my understanding, of course.
But there is this larger context. So you have, on the one hand, Marxism and the Marxist tradition. Then, on the other hand, there are these intellectual tendencies that now prevail in the West, in the Western Academy. Now, my position, as you saw, is that these two intellectual worlds, the world of traditional Marxism and the world of this right-wing Hegelianism of the Western Academy, are inadequate. They're inadequate as a basis for insight and inadequate as an instrument of reconstruction. So I would like to understand whether the Russian intelligentsia today has a similar position, what it thinks about this. Does it surrender to these dominant tendencies in the Western Academy? Does it cling to Marxism, or is it struggling to develop an alternative position in the realm of thought?
May not try to answer, of course, but just give a small remark about this sort of debates. Among Russian intelligentsia, as I understand from just quite a young point of view, in our society now, for any innovator, for any reformator, the right for a mistake is much narrower than it was considered in early 90s because of quite a difficult period of these reforms, of these attempts to apply pure liberal model after pure Marxist model in our country. And as you told about the vibrant urban economy, about experiment, about reimagination, we speak about some new experiment in social life and economic life. And if we speak about some applied experiment in this country, it means that we face an important, a very serious responsibility for anybody who tries to propose it and to apply it. Maybe that's some, and the lack of responsibility, as I see it, is quite popular among Russian intelligentsia and among elites. That's why these debates about wide role of economics, they are very narrow, and they don't go further to strategies, just because of this fear of responsibility for new experiment.
It is impossible to have institutional alternatives if one doesn't have intellectual alternatives. No one can develop a different trajectory without having ideas. So I understand that there's a practical interest in development alternatives, but what strikes me in our countries is the poverty of the imagination. So the whole communist Soviet project relied on a doctrine, for better or worse. We can't have alternatives if we have no doctrine, if we have no way of thinking. Therefore, this task of reconstruction of the disciplines is inescapable. If we don't undertake this task, we are condemned to accept the institutional blueprint that is being disseminated from the North Atlantic world.
Наше поле дискуссии, оно своеобразно структурировано, поскольку мы все-таки евразийская цивилизация, и наша либеральная, как правило, интеллигенция – это в основном люди, опирающиеся как раз на представление неолиберализма и экономических учений о предельной полезности, о человеке как максимизаторе полезности и так далее. Вторая альтернатива – это апеллирование не к идеологии коммунистической, социалистической, а к традиционализму, к азиатскому обществу, к концепции власть-собственность, к преобладанию традиций, неформальных правил над правовыми регуляторами. И здесь экономизм помогает добиваться каких-то, на мой взгляд, определенных важных для стратегического развития общества решений. Что касается критики самого экономического подхода, скажем, с позицией коммуникативных каких-то теорий коммуникативного действия или теории, которая рассматривает социальное как некое социальное поле с его определенными участками правовыми, экономическими, которые находятся в горизонтальных взаимоотношениях. Это достаточно слабо выражено, поскольку нам пока еще не удалось освободиться от идеологических уз, и мы ведем дискуссию часто на уровне как раз европейское, азиатское, но европейское для нас оно не рассматривается очень дифференцированно, что есть модели чисто национальные или просто есть либеральные демократические, социальные демократические, вот примерно на таком уровне.
Well, I make a very concrete proposal. The proposal is that we should attempt in our countries to create another kind of economic thought and another kind of legal thought. And we should disseminate this new kind of thought throughout the world. We should be the origin.
Варюшин Михаил, Высшая школа экономики. У меня вот вопрос следующего характера и небольшая ремарка. Начну с ремарки, пожалуй. Вот мне кажется, что все-таки в большей степени ведется борьба даже не между правым гегельянством и марксизмом, а скорее всего между позитивизмом и гегельянством и марксизмом. Потому что, в принципе, Маркс показал, что та рыночная экономика, которая существует, существовала в период, по крайней мере, который он был современником, это сущий хаос. И те законы, которым учил, предположим, тот же самый Конт, это не законы, это видимость закона. И Маркс, в принципе, говорил, что в данном случае необходимо обуздать и перевести из царства данной необходимости в царство свободы, в царство рациональной свободы. И вот как раз вот к этой дискуссии я хотел бы добавить, что в принципе сейчас, по крайней мере, скорее всего, в российской правовой и экономической науке, я не экономист, я юрист, в частности, скорее всего, буду говорить о правовой науке, то занимаются в большей степени переводами, даже не наукой, а переводной литературой. Это вот, к сожалению, показывает некую идейную скудость. И это, к сожалению, беда. То есть российская интеллигенция перешла от самостоятельной мысли к переводам. И вот, к сожалению, вот такое засилие, оно чревато тем, что постепенно мы приходим к пониманию единственного идеала – это homo economicus, рационального максимизатора чистой прибыли и ничего более. Хотя, в принципе, вот те, опять же, вот традиции и наследия советской эпохи, сейчас, по крайней мере, высказываются такие мнения, что единственным недостатком плановой экономики было отсутствие информации. Вот как вы считаете, если бы, предположим, вот в современном информационном обществе при наличии плановых регулятивных механизмов, ну, с использованием, естественно, элементов конкуренции, предположим, можем взять как пример новую экономическую политику 20-х годов, вот возможно ли взять за альтернативу этот проект, потому что тот либеральный проект, который есть сейчас, он постепенно терпит крах как на европейской территории, так и на территории Российской Федерации, в принципе, Североатлантического альянса, как вот показывает последние годы и статистика. Как вот вы считаете, возможно ли это как альтернативный проект сочетание плана с учетом информационного общества и частной инициативы? То есть то, что примерно было вот в 20-х годах. Спасибо.
I've made clear my position that it's not enough to achieve some kind of balance between the market and the state. That's what we have in the world. That's the old form of the ideological discussion. Its assumption is the market, but the market has to be balanced against the state. I propose a completely different view of the task. The task is to reshape what a market economy is, to reshape how independent civil society is organized, and how we understand democratic politics. So a radical democratization of the market economy and a radical deepening of democracy. Now, in this task, many historical experiments, such as the ones to which you refer, could be taken as sources of inspiration. That was the sense of the 19th century American examples that I gave earlier in our conversation. But we can't fool ourselves into thinking that there are historical models that can somehow do for us the work of reconstruction. All they can be is material. They can provide incitements, but they can't replace the task today of reconstruction and reimagination.
If you don't mind, I make a short intrusion. Just want to try to answer in a kind of combined way to the question what type of debate we have in economics. Actually, I would agree with Professor Saligian in a sense that current elite is not too much interested in a serious, I would say, broad debate and a broad agenda for such a conceptual debate, so that the principal approach is basically to surrender to what is established paradigm in sphere of economic analysis and approach. And why this surrender did happen, I think there are at least two reasons. One reason is just intellectual capacity and deep capture of knowledge and education as a result of such an intellectual capacity of the established mode of economic analysis in North Atlantic world, which was imported to Russia. So it's easier to import something established, developed, deliberated, sophisticated, comparing to local, small and nascent ideas, non-elaborated in such a sophisticated way. And second aspect, which may be of the same importance, comparable importance at least, is utility of such an approach, because this approach, which is mathematical in method, technical in its methodology, and same time it's quite manipulative in its potential. So using data analysis as a tool and showing to the public and to expert society a lot of data and formula and economic models you can manipulate with results. So basically showing those effects, those policy advice which you wanted to show. So it's a kind of pre-established ideas which you can describe through these techniques. And it's very fancy currently in Russia after all those experimentalism in policy and in through Soviet times, I mean, through revolutionary periods, and certain, I would say, frustration as a result of those waves of experimentalism in society, and apathy as a result of this frustration, kind of depression. These technocratic methods are fancy because they say we try to be rational actors, we try to introduce a rational form of policy making, so then let's rely on data analysis, let's rely on sociological studies, and let's rely on established methodology introduced in the used in the Western world, which is a successful world, so it's a role model. So a lot of factors.
But I understand this as an explanation of the attitudes of the political elite and their technocratic servants. But what about the academic elite? Is there not an academic elite that has large ambitions and that wants to develop an intellectual project different from the intellectual project that prevails in the Western academy?
I just say small remark and then Leo will correct me if I'm not true. So my perception, we somehow lost this independent class or social strata of academics who could oppose themselves to established political and business elites and its technocratic servants. So that's maybe a problem of this period of transition, and maybe it's a result of the Soviet system, which basically suppressed academic independency, academic, let's say, brevity to be independent. So academics did not dare to oppose established, political elite. So now we somehow inherited this lack of intellectual brevity, lack of intellectual capacity to be independent. And maybe I'm not.
I would like to venture another explanation, and I hope it provokes some discussion. Russian intelligentsia or Soviet intelligentsia was part of the Soviet middle class. It was an important part of the Soviet middle class. The Soviet middle class, since 1900, I would say 98, has been 4 times expropriated, not 98, I'm sorry, 89, has 4 times expropriated and materially destroyed. The institutions within which academic life flourished within the Soviet period have been destroyed. The material safety net which the Soviet Union and the Soviet system provided for was cut to pieces, and Russia has been reduced in a very tragic way to what a World Bank study of 1991 about the Soviet economy proposed as the competitive advantage of the Soviet Union in the world economy. And this is, first, to export natural resources, second, to export human talent and qualification, third, to import cheap mass production from Europe and other Western countries. And so for a period of, I would say, 10 to 12, 14 years, with many extreme lows like the catastrophe of deregulation, mass privatization, and liberalization of 1992, 1993, 1994, which we all remember as market shock or shock therapy, and to the financial crisis of 1998, have led to many talented people simply to also leave the country. So the institutions were destroyed, the material safety net for independent intellectual work was cut to pieces, and the true richness of the country, which was the qualification of its people, has been largely exported. And what remains is a servile class of technocrats working in the interest of international capital and in, up to a certain point, of an oligarchic class. And this is not a fertile ground of debate or for debate.
Well, my only qualification, Leo, and I suppose you wouldn't disagree with this, is that there's no simple linear relationship between intellectual flourishing and material constraint. After all these ideas that we commemorate of people like Hegel and Marx were produced in circumstances of extreme material constraint and national disintegration. So it's not a sufficient explanation of why the intelligentsia doesn't embrace a revolutionary project of intellectual originality.
But I think that what I've said, I mean, I'm absolutely agreeing with you, but I think what I've said before is the attempt to describe some of the conditions, and probably on a timeline up to a certain point in time. I'm not sure whether what I have said before is valid also for the last 3, 4, 5 years.
But if I understand you correctly, you're saying that the material circumstance resulted in an experience of national demoralization for the intelligentsia, and that this climate of demoralization is hostile to the creation of strong intellectual projects.
And I would say there's something which is very dangerous, because it sometimes borders on nostalgia, which is absolutely not productive. I think it would be very important for the self-esteem of an entire cultural and intellectual class in Russia to look back on its traditions in a more complex and in a way which differentiates to a high degree. Being to a certain extent a scholar of Soviet and Russian law, I always disagree with the fact that Soviet law was something which has to be just taken off the table. It's an interesting variation of continental European law, and it is a tradition which is very serious and worthwhile considering, also for the purpose of giving material for future social experiments and political experiments. So I think overcoming all kinds of nostalgia and absolutely not arguing here in favor of the Soviet experiment as a whole, I think it is absolutely necessary that the Russian intelligentsia accepts that it is building upon the fertile ground, also fertile ground of a Soviet experience, and I think this up to now is not the case.
Девушка вот хотела.
Professor, may I ask you an optimistic question? If we imagine that this revolutionary project, I don't know how, but it was born by a Russian intelligentsia, by any creative intelligentsia, what should be the major target audience for this project, both within the country and outside the world? Young scholars, elites, some debates with North Atlantic universities?
Well, I'm not advocating simply the creation of national schools of thought. I'm advocating the creation in our countries of intellectual alternatives for the whole world. We were just talking about this before our meeting today. Today in the world, the orthodoxy is universal. We sometimes call it neoliberalism, for example. And these tendencies of thought that I described as right-wing Hegelianism that are in the service of the universal political economic orthodoxy. The heresies, to the extent that heresies exist, are purely local. So there are local deviations or local forms of resistance to a universal orthodoxy. A universal orthodoxy cannot be successfully resisted by merely local heresies. A universal orthodoxy can only be effectively combated by universalizing heresies, as liberalism and socialism were in the 19th century. So that's what I'm advocating, that we use our national experience and our national circumstance as an inspiration to the formation of ideas that are addressed to the whole world, and not just to us.
Colleagues, actually, Professor has a flight today in the early afternoon, so just maybe two last questions from lady over there and gentleman. Maybe three last questions. Yeah. Will you take three last questions or comments? Sorry, first.
I just have short remark and short question. It's a remark that there is an economical institution in Russia. It's a new economic school, and you can discuss in new economic ideas with Professor Guriev. It's just one of the representative of Russian intelligentsia with brandly new idea in economics. And as about answer question. I mean, remark is that we have economic institution in Russia. It's called New Economic School with a head of Professor Guriev. So if you would have some interest in the future, you can discount.
Advertising?
A little bit, but have no connection whatsoever. I'm a lawyer by myself, so and I have a question. Maybe if you have some prediction, maybe what impact would have the development of artificial intellect to the institution and especially labor institutionalization, as you've said before, that now machine they can only repeat action. What if in near future, as scientists predict, machine would decide whole new tasks, not only repeat actions, but produce them themselves? So, thank you.
Maybe we collect questions and then Professor will
have to
answer.
go.
Yes.
Yes.
The question is about international economic institutions. In Russia, there is now a big debate that old institutions do not work anymore, and there is a proposal to create new. In this context, I would like to ask you, what do you think about the BRICS organization and its future?
And the gentleman over there.
Dear Professor, thank you for a great speech, but I speak Russian. Связано как раз с БРИКС, у меня вопрос и небольшой комментарий. Мы все видим, что глобально в мире жесткая конкуренция среди корпораций, среди государств, среди союзов, blocks. Thank you very much. В России сильны традиции интеллектуальные, в том числе на базе ГУ, Института Высшей школы экономики, МГУ и так далее. И вот результатом такой жесткой конкуренции вот, в свое время стало падение Советского Союза, да, и не совсем согласен, что интеллигенция российская разрушена, она, наверное, трансформируется и возрождается на базе вот, как раз молодежи. Вот. И мы услышали ваш призыв в части установления новых правил экономических, глобальных. Вот. И нужна, наверное, для выработки такая глобальная площадка. Как вы считаете, такой площадкой, где можно озвучить эти правила, которые действительно нужны? Гегемония США и доллара, наверное, рано или поздно должна уступить более эффективной модели мировой. Так вот, площадкой для обсуждения новых правил, как вы считаете, может стать G20 или БРИКС, или каким-либо другим блоком продвигать новые идеи? Потому что идей много, как я уже сказал, российская интеллигенция сильна, она и возрождается. Есть точки роста, такие как Сколково, где конкретные научные проекты и их коммерциализации с участием зарубежных компаний, конечно. Есть российские корпорации уже сильные, конечно, базирующиеся на ресурсах, но тем не менее они развиваются и в научно-исследовательских направлениях также. Вот. То есть площадками могут стать такие корпорации для продвижения этих правил, да, как заинтересованные. Вот. И, наверное, какие-то околоправительственные и интеллектуальные круги, вот, которые будут каким-либо образом выводить свои идеи на БРИКС или там еще выше на G20. Спасибо. Thank you very much.
So I'll just say one very brief thing, and then I really have to leave. I have been involved very, very directly in the BRIC movements, and I believe that the association of the BRIC countries can help to create conditions that in the future will allow us to overthrow this Metternichian project that exists in the world. Since the Second World War, the great powers have been attempting to impose a blueprint, an institutional blueprint on all of humanity. And the BRICS are the single most important source of potential resistance to this project. At the same time, I register my impression that the greatest weakness of the BRIC movement and of its potential to resistance is the lack of alternative ideas. What I observe is the prevalence in our countries of mental colonialism. So there is some measure of resistance in practical politics and in economic life. Where there is least resistance is in the realm of thought. Now, ideas by themselves don't change the world. But without ideas, no one can change the world. Thank you very much.
Yeah, just final thank you for Professor and Leopold Specht for coming to us. And thanks once again to Open University Skolkovo and High School of Economics who organized this event for us and organized this broadcasting. Actually, it's live so people can see it online. And then it would be recorded and published on hse.ru website and Open University Skolkovo website as well. So it would be distributed, disseminated all around country to trigger some more discussions, debate, and maybe to address to broader audience of young intellectuals. Also, we want to say that I hope at least High School of Economics, and I'm involved in law department, and Professor Saligin, who is here as the dean of law department, would try to encourage intellectuals involved into the faculty and students to develop new ideas and to bring certain new proposals for this rebellion agenda of global reconstruction. And Skolkovo, mentioned here, is definitely up to those initiatives to support new transformative way of business organization and development of small and medium enterprises. So I hope at least partially part of those ideas would be shortly introduced into our current social and political agenda. So thank you very much again, Professor. Thank you very much for coming, everybody. Have a good day.